We've now reached John chapter 5, and we have a miracle of a healing at the pool. I'm going to read to you from verse 1 all the way down to verse 15. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a feast of the Jews. Now, there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here, a great number of disabled people used to lie: the blind, the lame, the paralysed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he'd been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." And at once the man was cured, and he picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath, and so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." And the man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. A very famous story, the pool of Bethesda, a healing that takes place, and a controversy that the healing arises. We'll look at both of those elements there. I want to look at this really in 2 parts. The first part is about the healing itself, and the second part is the way the healing is received. So, sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a feast of the Jews. It doesn't actually say what that feast was, but there are some people who suggest it might be the Feast of Tabernacles or some other feast. I think, as far as I'm concerned, it's irrelevant. It doesn't really matter which feast it was. All that matters is that Jesus had left Capernaum, Cana, and travelled all the way back up to Jerusalem. It's some time later, which means it's an indefinite time, which means it could be a matter of some weeks, it could be a matter of a year. Who's to say? Doesn't really matter either. All that matters is the events that take place here. Now, there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Now you might say, that's an interesting description of this place. And why are we told about, say, the 5 colonnades? You might find all manner of people mystifying and speculating and spiritualizing the 5 colonnades might be representative of the 5 stages of man, or the 5 who knows what. All of that, of course, is a nonsense, I would say, because all that we're being told here is that this is a real place. This is something which you can go and check for yourself. This is something which has a location, which is by a certain location in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, a pool, by Bethesda, surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. So if you want to go and check this out for yourself, it's there. So the description being presented to us suggests there's evidence. This is real. It's not made up. It's a real place, and you can check it for yourself. A lot of the important elements here are things which you may want to doubt at first instance. You may want to question that John is saying is true. But the point here, implicit in this, is that this is rooted in fact. It's rooted in real geography. It's rooted in real places. It's rooted, therefore, in real events by implication. And that's the importance, it seems to me, of the name, the location by the sheep gate, being a pool, called Bethesda, surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Now here, he says, a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, and the paralysed. And some manuscripts add, and not all manuscripts do, they waited for the moving of the waters. And some less important manuscripts continue, and from time to time an angel of the Lord would come down and stir up the waters, and the first one into the pool after each such disturbance would be cured of whatever disease he had. That's not in the best manuscripts, which is why it wasn't in the passage which has been read out from John. But you get the idea. The idea is that there is something magical and mysterious, maybe an angel stirring the waters, but a lot of people gather around this pool, and there is a disturbance, a bubbling up. So we have the idea of a natural spring pool, and the bubbling up often happens in these kind of pools as air and other pockets of carbon dioxide or something like that bubbles back up through the stream that fills the pool. Whether it's disturbed by an angel or not, I would suggest to you, and from my point of view, and since it's not in the original, in the best tested manuscripts, that I will put that down to a superstition. In fact, I will put down the whole idea that people are gathering around this pool as a classic superstition of the time. People thought that it was an angel, maybe. People thought that there was something divine or mysterious about the bubbling of the water in the pool, and something had attracted the attention that if you get down into the pool, as soon as the bubbling occurs, then you will be cured. Now, that's a very common idea as far as superstitions are concerned, where people believe that a certain place, a certain location, a certain happening is something which is so unusual that if it does happen, then you can attribute miracles to it. The infrequency of the occurrence is attributed to the miraculous, and therefore you might associate automatically the idea that if that happens, this rare event happens, then something special is going to take place because of its rarity. But I would put the whole thing down to nothing more than a superstition. You might say, well, how could it be a superstition that was the case? How could it survive if people didn't actually properly get healed? But you see, we have very many instances of things happening like that in our own day. People who go to particular locations, certain grottos, maybe in France, places in Lourdes. There's a whole industry set up for people to be cured by taking trips to certain places where there's been some miraculous event, so-called, taken place. And there's a huge number of people give up time, money, energy, because they believe solidly in what really is no more than a superstition. You might think that people might be alerted to the fact that it doesn't work if when they go down into the pool they find that they are not cured. But the thing is that people are persuading themselves very easily that certain cures take place when in reality later on they're not properly cured. However, this man here, he is someone who's been there for a long time. He was somewhat bedridden, not completely bedridden, somewhat weakened, but he was someone who could get down into the pool unaided by himself, but so slow was he that people would often jump in before him or get ahead of him when they had the bubbling of the pool taking place. It's not told how frequently this might have happened. It might have been once a week, it might have been once a month, it might have been once a year, how infrequently these things took place, but none of that is important here. Everyone believed in something, whether it was true or not, as people believe in superstitions, and people would go down into the water to seek to be cured, and they would come out probably claiming that after their wait and their time that they felt somewhat better than they'd gone before they had been, before they'd gone into the pool. So a great tradition and probably a great superstition in my view. That's how these things gather and accumulate. The man had been there for some time, and that's an important point of fact too, because some people might suggest that some of these miracles which Jesus performed, some of these signs, are done often with accomplices, maybe. This man could not possibly have been an accomplice, so that rules that out entirely. You can't pretend to be cured like many faith healers these days might try to cure someone, and if they're a fake faith healer, they will come along and they'll bring someone in the audience and put them in the audience there who is perfectly normal. And this has been known to happen in the past, and when they pray their prayer or say whatever they say, they get up off their crutches, throw their crutches away and walk to the front. It instills faith, they believe, in the rest of the congregation and allows people to enhance the reputation of the faith healer. All of that has been well attested in the past. And here you could not possibly say this is the case in this matter. This is ruled out entirely, that there can be no collusion here, because this man has been lying here for how long? He's been there for 38 years, most of his life probably, because people didn't live that long. So most of his life he's been lying on this pool, doing very little. And then Jesus comes along, and Jesus has been walking around the pool. I imagine that he's been talking to people, and people have been talking to him. People have been pointing out various individuals around. I would guess that anyone who has been here around this pool for 38 years is probably the person who has been there the longest. It's hard to imagine anyone to have been there longer than 38 years. He has probably been singled out by maybe everyone else who knows him as being the guy who's been here the longest, the most dedicated, the most has the most faith in the operation of this pool, and someone who has given up his life to staying here. Everyone knows him. Everyone would point him out, and Jesus might, in conversation with whoever he speaks to, they might have said, and that guy over there, he's been here the longest. He's been here 38 years. I imagine something like that might have taken place. Jesus goes over to him. And when Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he'd been in his condition for a long time, he asked him, do you want to get well? Now, on the face of it, that's a foolish question. Do you want to get well? Why would you ask such a question as that? I mean, the guy has been waiting to get well for 38 years. He's been hoping for nothing other than to get well for 38 years. Here he is, waiting at the poolside for a disturbance of the waters, happening so infrequently he can't even get down into the water, and every time someone beats him to it, of course he wants to get well. It's a non sequitur. It goes without saying. And yet Jesus asks the question. And that's a puzzle. You'd wonder why he didn't say something like, if you want to get well, don't bother with this, trust me instead. Assuming that he did. But if you ask yourself, why does he say that? I think it's almost Socratic in its approach. Starting with people from where they are, trying to understand what they think and what they feel, trying to understand them as individuals. Do you want to get well? Maybe the implication here is, do you really want to get well? Or are you just settled into this life of indolence, lying down by the pool and doing very little else? Do you really want to get well? Maybe that's the impact of what's being said here. Or maybe it's simply the idea that Jesus wants to understand this person better and see what his motivations are. The answers could have been manifold and many different. He could have just been bubbling up with total resentment. It could have been a negative emotions that he gets from that. I'm fed up of being here. He could have got a bickering response like, what do you think I want, why else would I be here? Are you being stupid or something? But maybe he's testing out a person's character and personality with all of these rather basic and simple questions. But whatever it is, It's something which gets to the heart of the matter and to the heart of the person and to the central importance of what he's doing there. And the man responds and he says, "Sir," the invalid replied, and notice "sir," that's a word which is a word of respect. It's not, "Of course I want to get well. What a stupid question." No, it's a respectful man who he's speaking to after all this time. "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred." It's almost an implicit call for help. It's an explanation of why I've been there for 38 years. It's not laziness. It's not I like lying around by the side of a pool because it's an enjoyable lifestyle. But I have a reason for being here for this long. I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. And while I am trying to get in, so this is someone who's not completely helpless, not totally paralyzed. An entirely paralyzed man would probably find it almost impossible to get in. Possibly he could drag himself with his arms if it was just leg paralysis of some kind. We don't really know his situation, but certainly he has the ability to get in himself, but it takes a long time to do so. Too long for him to benefit from the waters, because it seems that the first person in is the first person cured. At least that was the superstitious belief of the time. And while I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me, so continual frustration bubbling up here. Then Jesus said to him, and he cuts through the explanation, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." Now, it's interesting. It's interesting that he says pick up your mat and walk, because that's unusual, I would say. Why would he not simply say, get up and walk, and why pick up your mat and walk? I suppose picking up your mat and walk implies something. It implies you're not going to be coming back again. And maybe many of the people who went down into the pool were temporarily relieved of whatever symptoms they had. Maybe the exertion of getting into the pool actually accomplishes some kind of hope and encouragement, which fosters the faith, which gives them a bit of extra energy to spur them back on. But maybe they might return fairly soon. Who's to say? But here, pick up your mat. That implies you're not coming back. Don't bother leaving it there, because you won't be needing it anymore at this point. Pick up your mat and walk means this is a complete and total health restoration. It's something which is going to mean that you'll never need to stay by the pool. And that's why I suppose Jesus asked him if he really wanted to get well, because for 38 years you're basically living in this one place, hardly able to move, and all your relations and friends bringing food to you and whatever sustenance you need to keep yourself going. So, take up your mat and walk. And at once the man was cured. Now, this is not like the faith-healing cures of others, because this is something which radically alters this person's life, something which he couldn't do before. He struggles to get down into the water, but here he gets up and picks up his mat and walks away. And at once this man was cured, and he picks up his mat and walked. If we're right in believing that this man of 38 years at the pool was well known by everybody, then everybody must have been startled at that. Everybody must have been amazed by it. And what would the effect be of that? Well, crowds would gather round. Crowds would gather round Jesus, and crowds would gather round the man who'd got up and was walking away after 38 years by the side of a pool. This is an astonishing reversal, and something which would have been drawn to the attention of everybody at that pool. Everybody would have known about it, because once 2 or 3 or 4 people start to come over, 4 or 5 or 10 or 15 and 20 come over, and then the whole pool's attention is on Jesus. It's not surprising then that the crowd envelops him and he disappears into that crowd and no one can find him or didn't know who he was. In fact, the man who was lying down at the pool probably had never heard of Jesus before because he didn't get out much. One way of putting it. But he didn't get around much and probably people didn't say much about what the news was. He hadn't been out to hear Jesus speak, didn't know who he was, didn't know anything about him. And all he knew was that this man came and assisted him and cured him. Jesus disappears into the crowd and is gone.